be, would you raise your hands if you think you might like to go to an hour of a movie tonight, or an hour of a movie another night, just to see how much interest we have in the room?
Or short movie, I would love to show you if you're interested. Normally 10 o'clock is I early sleep and early wake up. But we have also another movie, Jan. It's about ritual dance of Tibetan ritual dance movie. It's about an hour and 20 minutes. This is gives us about ritual, many kinds of ritual dance, and I'm explaining each one what that's all about. If they're sort of interested, or basically up to you, and we're here for.
So here's my idea. Perhaps we could say that tonight there will be a movie.
Okay.
It will either be half of the one movie or perhaps the other. And then if you start it with an introduction, then you can go to sleep. and those of us who want to watch could continue. Would that be?
Of course, wonderful.
Okay, that's what we'll do. So I think we'll have the movie we planned originally. We'll have half tonight and then half tomorrow night. And then you can go to sleep, and everyone who wants can watch.
All right, so can I get Amy Butler and Rabbi Rosen back on, Pastor Butler, and thank you so much, you guys. Thank you. We're going to get back started, and I'm going to flip this on. So thank you so much for your patience. All right, and Peter, you're up.
So we are back to the second session, or should I say it's the second half of the first session. And now the question is now the third cluster of questions will be coming up. And for the background, let me say that the theme of this conference is cross-cultural conversation on identity. And in that connection, I would like to draw your attention to what I was saying yesterday about the practice of monocategorization of people, that is looking at people through a single identity lens. I said that sometimes this comes in handy when the motive is to seek empowerment for a particular group, but the consequence of such practice can also be diabolical when the motive is to inflate only one of the many social identities that people bear with the intention of projecting the otherness of the other as something despicable. We see these things happening all the time. It is time to be aware, for example, that an attempt at a reconfiguration of power structures within a multi-religious society may be designed to highlight religious identity alone. A review of religious riots, be that between members of two denominations of the same religion or that of two different religions, does show that such incidents have taken place innumerable times in history, when people, even having the same ethnicity, speaking the same language, etc., have inflicted enormous suffering on each other in the name of religious difference. So, now comes the question. In this context, tell us what each of you think to be the best way for members of a multi-religious society to prevent such possible abuse of religious identity from taking place. Is it utterly unrealistic to imagine a new phase of human civilization that would succeed in discarding the hard boundaries that are perpetuating the we and they divide along the line of religious identity? If you think that it is not unrealistic, share with us from what you derive your hope. If yes, tell us what you see as principal hindrance for that.
Who do you want to go first?
You begin.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow, I'm actually getting a chance to go first.
I'm very fair, you know.
Yes, I know, I can
I'm
see that.
keeping an
Thank
eye
you.
on what I'm doing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, but I'm wondering with 4 questions and 5 presenters, who will go first next?
Well, it doesn't have to be that way. I'm only noticing, who has problem, who has advantage, who would rather not speak, and who would say more. I'm doing it that way.
Right. So thank you for giving me this chance to speak on this subject, and I'm very grateful to be present with all these other 4 panelists here who are sharing their wisdom and their knowledge. And I'm very pleased to be invited in this space, and thank you for welcoming me and giving me this opportunity. So I'm going to go back very quickly to the question you asked about what gives me hope, and how can those boundaries be blurred, and what practices can we sort of put in place to be able to divide or sort of blur those we and them and make it about us. So I'm going to draw on that same verse, 49:13. That is what gives me hope through my scripture and my tradition, that the otherness is an opportunity to learn. It's a pedagogical tool to get to know more about myself, more about others, more collectively, and like I said, the interconnectedness that we share. We're all connected, and that can be a very beautiful journey. So that is where I derive my hope. And for me, the best practices, or perhaps something that might help to facilitate this conversation, this cross-cultural conversation, would be 3 aspects. It has to do with intentionality, of entering into that space where we want to blur that boundaries, the intentionality of staying in that place while we are in conversation with others, and then how I dissect what I have taken with me when I exit that space. So for me, these are 3 crucial moments. The first moment is coming into that space of learning about the other. And in the context of the Islamic tradition, it has either been to subjugate the other as a minority, as colonial authorities have done. I come from a previously colonized country, and who doesn't? So there were these masters who stepped in, and they studied us. And they studied us because they wanted to subjugate us. They wanted to divide and rule. They wanted authority and power. So they came into the space of the other, and they wanted to learn about the other. But the intentionality was problematic. And Judith Burling talks about this in her book. The other, post 9/11, when you want to learn about the other, and especially when you want to learn about Muslims in America, it seems to be out of wanting to know that they are just like us. They watch Netflix, they have cell phones, and it's okay. So it's somehow aimed at addressing the anxiety of the majority, trying to get everybody to calm down, that it's all right, they look different, but they're just like us. They have waffles for breakfast. Which again might be a problematic lens to enter into that space. So for me, again, drawing from 49:13, Q 49:13, I would say coming into that space with the intentionality not just to know about the national other, the gendered other, the cultural other, the religious other. No, I'm here to get to know the human other. The other human being in this room. For me, I think that intentionality impacts how I enter that space. And while I'm in that space, I am not going to try and believe or hope that I'm going to know everything about that tradition. Because I will only be listening to one perspective. And while you're listening to me today, you're listening to a perspective of a person who comes from a South Asian origin, who is a woman, who practices a minority Muslim tradition, and who has faced the challenges of being a visibly Muslim woman of color in this country. So you're only getting that perspective. So while I'm in that space reminding myself I don't know everything about everything in Islam, I only know, or I'm only being shown that one perspective. And then as I exit the space, to know that I have only sort of scratched the tip of the iceberg. Just because I attended a conference, just because I attended an interfaith event, I cannot speak for or even speak about the others who were in that room. I can only say that I had an opportunity to speak with someone who represented one aspect of another faith. So I think these are the practices about intentionality that might facilitate the CCC that you're attempting to understand in this panel. Thank you.
What's the best way for members of a multi-religious society to prevent possible abuse of religious identity? Well, here's one idea, a very ancient idea that has worked for me, for members of my community, for India, for centuries. The truth is one, why speak of it differently? It comes from the Rig Veda, 5,000 years or more ago, and it prevented large-scale violence based on religion. There was always political violence and wars in India, but not religiously motivated. For a country that is very religious, with lots of variety and pluralism in religion, that there was no religiously motivated violence, it's a very unique thing. It's worth studying. I mentioned it yesterday, I think. Robert Wright, he writes in this book, The Evolution of God, where he talks mostly about the Abrahamic traditions. And he considers the question, how can we have peace between the major Abrahamic religions? And he brings in this idea from the ancient Hindus that the truth is one, why speak of it differently? It leads to pluralism, since the why speak of it differently, although they are all referring to the one truth. In that case, you can have multiple expressions of that truth, and it's all right to teach differently, to use different language, different philosophies, different theologies. How is this possible? Because that ultimate reality, it is one, but it is seen as being infinite and capable of expression in many, many different ways. When you try, it's beyond language. One description in Sanskrit is avang manasagochara, beyond mind and beyond language, beyond mind and beyond word. So that which is beyond conception and beyond language, when we try to conceive it and bring it into language, you can conceive it in many, many different ways, all of which would be right in some way and wrong in other ways. You can express it in different language. A much later verse, a very beautiful verse from the Shiva Mahimna Stotra expresses the same sentiment. It says, Trayi Sankhya Yogam Pashupati Matam Vaishnavamiti Prabhinne Prasthane Paramidamadapatyamiti Cha Ruchinam Vaichitryat Rijukutilanana Pathajusham Nrinameko Gamya Tvamasi Payasam Arnava Iva. Beautiful verse recited by many, many Hindus throughout the centuries. It means the Vedas, the Sankhya philosophy, the Yoga philosophy, the Pashupata philosophy, worshippers of Shiva, the Vaishnava philosophy, the worshippers of Vishnu, all of these are different paths. And depending upon the inclination of the worshippers, they all use these different paths, but they reach the same goal. They reach you, my Lord, as all rivers run to the same ocean. So a very beautiful verse. And notice there is an emphasis on the, the inclination, the taste, if you will, the liking of the individual seekers. So the multiple paths are possible, multiple religions are possible, not only because of the infinite and ineffable nature of the ultimate reality, but also of the diverse nature of humanity. Because we are so different, it is very natural that in the economy of God, there will be different paths and different approaches to that ultimate reality. As many paths, so many fates. Not only are we open to a variety of traditions coming in India, but also from outside India, not only of the past, but of the future also. There will be many more paths which humanity may come upon, and they are all welcome and all honored. Now, one more point. How do you actualize this? One way from ancient India, which the Lama here is very well acquainted with, was Vada, debate, where you had experts from different philosophies who engaged with each other in a very, somebody called it an intellectual gladiatorial fight. You're convinced of the rightness of your position and of the wrongness of the position of the other, but you engage to discover the truth, to improve your own position. So this led to a wonderful flowering of Indian philosophy. For example, we're very friendly, but we are actually ancient adversaries. And it led to nearly 800 years of debate in India on things like the existence of God, the existence of a self, and so on. And what the result was, an enormous flowering of Indian philosophy. Extremely sophisticated. I was just saying that the philosophy that is taught in Tibetan monasteries comes from the Nalanda tradition in India and then further developed in Tibet. It's some of the most sophisticated and subtle philosophical thinking I've ever come across. So that's one beauty, one way of establishing harmony and in a multi-religious society. It requires knowledge. One thing I've noticed in India is because of the misunderstood idea of secularism, you don't teach religion to children. So just because you're afraid of religious conflict, you don't teach religion. That's how strange. Just reflect upon it. How strange is it that education is supposed to acquaint you with life and society, and one big part of life and society is religion. You want to remain silent about it. And if the society, if the government, if the community vacates the stage to teach the best ideas, the most liberal and most life-giving ideas in spirituality and religion, then the stage will not remain empty. There will be other much less, benevolent parties who will come and occupy the stage and teach what, more sectarian, more narrow ideas of religion to young minds. So knowledge is important, not only for the traditions, our own tradition. I find that there is a terrible lack of knowledge of one's own tradition in our communities.
Amy?
Thank you for that question. I loved the mono-characterization of people. I love that phrase. So what is the best way for us to live together? I'll just reference one thing I said in my last comments, which are these two rules that I try to live by. One is curiosity, always keeping an open mind to what is around you and how you can be in conversation with it. And the other is raising our level of discomfort, and that's already been mentioned in answer to this question about, especially for religious leaders, to be able to calm our people and to say, like, it is okay to enter into a situation that feels different or that we don't understand. God is here. And I guess that would lead me to the second part of this question, what to do. And I think it's really easy for religious leaders to get on a panel like this and say, well, we should do this or we should do this. And there really is no answer. So I want to share with you something that I do personally in my own life to cultivate this, because I think that's really where it starts. I think leaders have to lead by example, by being in intentional conversation with people who are on a different page than they are. And for me right now, that is a man named Todd Underwood who lives in Kansas City and owns a gun trading platform that sold the gun that George Zimmerman used to kill Trayvon Martin. And maintaining and cultivating a relationship with Todd for these past 5 or 6 years has been excruciatingly difficult and part of my own spiritual practice, so that I can show up here and say, like, being in that kind of conversation is so very wearing and difficult and hard, and it's going to take deep commitment on behalf of all of us that starts in our own lives. I think religious leaders are under the mandate to create the conditions in which that happens, in which we come into situations where we encounter people we don't know, where we open ourselves to mystery, and we are okay with not knowing. So I can just speak to that from my own personal situation. Where do I find hope? I just finished actually writing a book on this. It's called Beautiful and Terrible Things, and it's about how relationships are really the only thing that change us or shift the way that we see the world. And so it is absolutely critical for us to intentionally select and cultivate relationships that are pushing our boundaries, and then to create the conditions for our communities to do that too.
Thank you. David?
Thank you. Well, those are very beautiful words from Pastor Amy, and indeed allow me to endorse all the important insights that we've heard. Allow me also just to begin by talking very particularly, because I think it's very difficult not to be filled with hope if you are a believing Jew. I mean, our history really, on paper, looks quite hopeless and quite catastrophic, and still to be part of celebrating our own particular heritage, I think itself is a manifestation of how profound hope is at the heart of the religious experience. But there are plenty of examples of good periods of collaboration and cooperation between religions, and even going back as far as ancient Persia and Babylon and Alexander's Macedon, and of course Andalusia. And of course, there, as has been mentioned, there's India, which is an incredible example. There's also China, incidentally, where it's so good for Jews that they disappeared altogether, which is another problem. But nevertheless, there have been some very wonderful periods in history of accepting the other and respecting the other. So it's not beyond the bounds of human comprehension that we can live in a world where that is a reality. And for those who are still skeptical with regards to human nature, I would warmly recommend, if you haven't read it already, to get hold of a lovely book called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. He's not a religious person in any conventional sense, but it's such a wonderful book to make us understand the fundamental positivity and constructive character of human nature. So I would recommend that. Of course, this issue, as Anindita has mentioned, is inextricably bound up with identity, and above all, with the abuse of identity. Allow me to reiterate that identity is who we are, and we are all made up of composite components of identity, who we are as individuals, as part of families, as part of congregations, communities, part of peoples, part of nations, part of humanity, part of the sentient world, part of the cosmos as a whole, the natural creation. All these are components of our identity, and in a healthy condition, the inner circles, the smaller circles, open out into the wider circles and fructify them. So families contribute to community, communities or congregations, congregations contribute to communities, communities contribute to the wider society, and so on and so forth. But in order to do so, you have to feel secure within the wider context. Otherwise, you don't want to open up to it, especially if you feel threatened by it, and if you feel vulnerable, and if you are alienated from it. And that's, of course, what conflicts are all about. And because religion is inextricably bound up with identity, because religion seeks to give meaning to our understanding of who we are as individuals, as families, as congregations, as communities. So religion gets easily abused when people feel threatened, when people feel vulnerable to assault, where people feel that they are not comfortable in a wider context. So one one recipe, if Pastor Amy will allow me to indulge in precisely what she most eloquently criticized, one thing I would suggest that we need to try our best to do is to dredge the swamps in which the anopheles of alienation can breed. And that's economic alienation, that's social alienation, it's political alienation. It means above all seeking to do all we can to give people a sense of dignity, that they are welcome, that they are respected. That is the fundamental religious teaching of hospitality, which in the Abrahamic traditions is personified in the personality of Abraham. Abraham doesn't ask any visitors where they come from, what manifestos they sign, what parties they're affiliated to. The fact that he's a human being means hospitality, to affirm the dignity of the other. And the more we can affirm the dignity of the other, the more the components of identity become constructive. It's not a problem of we and they if we and they are perceived in a constructive manner. The problem is when we and they are perceived in a negative, destructive, even demonizing manner. So hospitality, and I would say especially interreligious hospitality, in other words, is important. Communities are coming into different parts of modern secular society and they do not feel respected, they do not feel welcomed. That kind of alienation of fear easily breeds not only strong alienation, deeper alienation, but violence. And if we therefore want to deal with these, we've got to deal, if you like, with their root causes. Allow me just to end this response by quoting the wonderful 3 guidelines of the late great Bishop of Stockholm, who had been the head of the Divinity School in Harvard, Christer Stendahl. His 3 interfaith guidelines, which I think are very relevant in our context. The first 2 are obvious. He says, always try to understand the other the way the other sees herself or himself, not the way third parties describe them. His second is always look at the other through the best that was in them. Don't judge them by the negative elements that exist within all communities. But he has a third guideline, which I think is really wonderful and is really important in terms of cross-cultural conversations and interreligious engagement. He says, leave room for holy envy. It's a beautiful concept, holy envy. It's wonderful when we meet one another and say, you do this, we do this. It's wonderful we have these things in common. But there's nothing disloyal to your own tradition to be able to see something wonderful in another tradition that's not necessarily part of your own heritage. And to be able to celebrate it and celebrate other communities and their own particular characters, their own particular forms, their own particular emphases. There are so many wonderful things because each religious culture, heritage, brings its own beauty, and to be able to see the beauty in the other and to have that holy envy. I can identify what I envy about Christians. I can tell you, I can identify things that I envy about Muslims. And I think the capacity to have that kind of envy in a constructive sense, holy envy, is really a very wonderful way of exhorting our communities to be able to engage one another on a basis of mutual love and admiration rather than any fear of alienation or hostility.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to say something?
Thank you so much. I didn't see any need to add it. Besides, really on the point. But if I might say, one hand, religion is I live in Philadelphia, and used to be those in the city, the churches are very magnificent. They might have lots of congregations. So nowadays, the church is getting emptier and emptier, and congregations are less and less. Monastics, nunnery in the United States and foreign countries, all over the world, is less and less monks and nuns. Where I go quite often in Canada, Benedictine monastery, extraordinary monastery, used to be 100 monks. Nowadays, 6 or 7 monks. The youngest monk about 70 years old. So one hand, that's where we've been living. plus religion or spirituality today is commercialized. Religion, spiritual, name of the spiritual is money making. So that's what we're living. But another hope we can see is this kind of conversations, and also what I know among the Buddhism case, we Tibet until 1940s were isolated, but yet due to the political reasons, Dalai Lama came out of Tibet. Indian government welcomed the Dalai Lama, and slowly there's among the Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, and among the Buddhism itself have a tremendous dialogue, having conversations, and brings a unity, understanding of what Buddha taught. So there is hopes, and there is also discourage what we're seeing today. So thank you.
This time, I'll go directly into the cluster of 4 questions. Given the differences that are surely there among the world religions in terms of metaphysics and mythology, iconography and rituals, and so on and so forth, is it possible to proclaim that despite these differences, there are common values that are recommended and cherished in these traditions? Although I have requested you to be a spokesperson only of your tradition so far, now is the exception. Can you elaborate with the help of examples that there are such common values? Can you tell us whether the gap between we and they be bridged if these values are implemented in actual practice? David?
Me?
Yeah. 3 times the number
Well-
1 speaker.
Yes, well, I have a relatively brief answer. I certainly believe that there are very essential, foundational characteristics of our religions that we share, as has already been articulated very beautifully by the Swami coming out of Indian, Hindu traditional perspectives. The most obvious one is the belief in transcendence, that there is more to the world that meets the eye, there is more to our material existence, that there is purpose, or that there can be, that there should be purpose to our existence, that this whole world is not an amazing accident, but is a world in which there is design and purpose, and that we find that meaning and that fulfillment through living a way of life that is above all based upon the values that have been articulated so wonderfully here today, of love, of dignity, of service, and therefore that come out of our shared ethical values. Doesn't mean that there aren't differences of nuance in these, but I think in essence they're the same. But I would conclude with the words of a great scientist, Albert Einstein, who wrote, "The most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead, a snuffed out candle. To sense that behind anything that can be experienced, there is something that our minds cannot grasp, whose beauty and sublimity reaches us only indirectly. This is religiousness."
Amy?
So Albert Einstein used to attend Riverside Church. I'm really glad he wasn't there when I was pastor. Thank you, everybody. I think what the rabbi said in his last answer is really important, that our lives and our communities reflect the values of common thriving and of building a society in which we are taking care of our neighbors. And we do that both on a personal level, as I said before, like people are watching our leaders. So what is it that you are doing that is having an impact here? And then it's also societal. So this is my frustration with a lot of Christians, where we separate the temporal from the spiritual. Jesus was all about like fixing the systems that we're in now or turning them over. And I think that that's fundamental to our faith. And until we understand that, we remain this sort of like group that's off to the side wanting to cultivate our differences. The only way that we have heft or relevance in a society that is multi-religious is how it is that we care for our neighbors. We've already heard from the other leaders today some very strong similarities in the way that we would define the heart of our faith. You know, care for neighbor, love for each other. And I loved that description of religion is like being in love. That's so beautiful. So I think what gives me hope in this moment is that there are people who are engaging these conversations and who are committed to dismantling the sort of structure of we versus they and making a space for us to build a society based on the beliefs that we actually share and celebrate those in the way that we engage with each other.
Okay, thank you. You?
Yeah, thank you. I echo everything that my co-panelists have shared until now, and this is a hopeful model. We're here in a room together to have this conversation. But to address your question of those shared values, I will need to take you to maybe 2 preliminary points, but I will stay within my 5 minutes. And the first is the understanding of the human being in Islam, the human identity from where the shared values emerge. So very quickly, the Islamic perspective on the composition of what it is to be human is a component of three items. There is the divine spirit, and we have the verses of the Quran that said that the corpus was made and then the divine spirit was blown into it. So there is a divine spirit which is equal in everything that is created. So even though we are different bodies in this room, different races maybe in this room, different abilities, different points in our age, what we share is that divine spirit, and each one of us has that in the same measure. And again, I don't say this just for the other human beings in this room, but also the more than human components of this island and where we are. So there is that one unifying factor, which is an essential component of who we are as human beings. And the other component is obviously the corpus, the body. And although I appreciate everybody's body here, the body is not the true identity, according to the Islamic teaching. The fusion of the body and the spirit creates something that is known in the Quran as the nafs, or the self, the ego. And that is what is distinctly unique about each and every one of us here in this room. So if I were to summarize that as an analogy of, a car, a vehicle, so the body would be the vehicle, the fuel would be the divine spirit, because you take that away and then it just becomes an inanimate corpse. And then the driver in that vehicle would be the self. So the Quranic commandments, the punishments, the deterrents, the rewards are addressed to the driver, not to the car, not to the fuel. And this conversation here is trying to invoke the drivers in us. And the driver is the identity. And the identity, according to a recent thinker, Murtada Mutahari, he wrote his book on divine justice. And he says the identity, the human identity, is impacted by two values: love and pain. Anyone who has experienced love never remains the same. Something categorically changes in them because love impacts them like nothing else. And if you've been in love, you would know what I'm talking about. And the second thing that impacts our identity is pain. When you've been hurt, something has changed in you. It has made you something different. And as human beings, I think, regardless of where we come from, what color, what gender, what religious identity, what cultural identity, we encounter love and pain every day. And perhaps these might be the shared values. And I will end by saying that, at least from the Islamic perspective, and sort of spanning out to all the different, I'm thinking of Israel, Palestine. I'm thinking of Rohingya Muslims. I'm thinking of the Hindu Nationalist Party in India. I'm thinking of colonization. I'm thinking of all these different crises that have impacted Muslim identity. But I'm also reminded that we all love and we all feel pain across these crises. And if there's anything that can result in a peaceful answer to these conflicts, it would be getting people in the room who still love and who are ready to talk about their vulnerability when they hurt. Now I'll stop there.
Thank you. Would you like to say something?
Well, thank you. I think the bottom line is we, as a humanity or any living being on this planet, or maybe another planet too, but we none of are looking for problem. We're all searching for peace or something, happiness. And no one searching or looking for any other things. So from my window, I've seen in Philadelphia the 95, so either day or night, either raining or snowing, people driving whole day long. None of looking for some kind of problem. None of looking for something, peace and happiness. That's the bottom line. We all have a desire, whether we are believer or non-believer. So that's the equally we all have include we each one be coming here weak. That's what we're searching for. The best answer, which I believe, the Dalai Lama said, my religion is my kindness. The kindness is we need it. Thank you.
Swami.
So given the differences, can we have that there are common? Can we have common values which are recommended and cherished in all these traditions? I'm reminded of Ken Wilber, who said that if organized religions are to survive in the 21st century, speaking to what the Lama observed, that congregations are getting smaller, monastics are disappearing, and people are losing interest in religion. So Ken Wilber said, organized religions need to get their act together and do these three things. One is, they need to stop fighting with each other. That's something that turns up, especially young people in this century, a lot. So criticizing, fighting with each other, that has to stop. The second thing is that it's not just between religions. Religion and science, like it or not, we live in an age of science. So it's not just harmony between religions, but harmony between religion and science. So religions, Ken Wilber says, at least need to stop teaching or holding on dogmatically to things which are completely already disproved by mainstream science, at least. We need to stop doing that. And the third thing he said was modern values regarding gender and race and equality and democracy and human rights. So these things, sometimes religions reject or are seen contrarian because of holding on to old dogma, an anxiety about feeling threatened by these new changes. It can't be helped. Religions need to adapt, grow, at least not be seen outright against modern values which are held by large numbers of young people today, especially in these societies. So these three things, how can we do that? 2 words. One is perennial philosophy, and the other one is cosmopolitanism.
What?
Cosmopolitanism. The perennial philosophy actually is the name of a book, not much read these days, but a very interesting, lovely book by Aldous Huxley, where he sets forth the agenda there that all the religions of the world have amongst them a highest common denominator, that they all are ultimately about the same ultimate reality, and they all set out different paths and practices which enable us to realize that reality in our lives. And it's a beautiful book and a testament to his enormous range of reading and learning. It just struck me just now. Perennial philosophy, if you translate it into Sanskrit, would be Sanatana Dharma, which is the eternal. We often translate it as eternal religion, but you can translate it as perennial philosophy also. It's another name for Hinduism, actually. I never thought of that. But there are, it's not surprising because Aldous Huxley himself was pretty close to Swami Prabhavanandaji, who was the founder of the Vedanta Society in Southern California. So the perennial philosophy, that belief that underlying all these religions are deep fundamental truths. Not that the similarities between religions are superficial, rather the differences are superficial. And from the perspective of those fundamental truths, you can enjoy and be nourished by the differences in mythology and metaphysics and iconography and rituals. Let me give an example. A young Indian man once asked me that, how can I accept what religions say? They all seem to be saying different things. For example, he said, the Muslims pray on Friday, the Jews on Saturday, the Christians on Sunday, and the Hindus almost every day of the week. So, so what's right and what's wrong? Now, from a perennial philosophy perspective, it would be, for example, a principle like, you ought to think of God or that ultimate reality all the time, but you cannot, and therefore you have sacred times. So a sacred day. You could have, it could be Friday, it could be Saturday, it could be Sunday, or if you're a worshipper of Shiva, it could be Monday, or worshipper of the Divine Mother, it could be Tuesday, and whatever. But that's the principle underlying it. It's a beautiful idea that you set aside a particular day for intensive spiritual centeredness or spiritual practice. Likewise, for a holy place, every place is holy because of the divine, but then as poor limited human beings, we need to focus or bear down on one particular place. So it could be a place of pilgrimage with a special spiritual significance. It could be a mosque, a temple, a church, or gurdwara, and so on. It could be special objects. We know the ultimate reality is not an object, and yet to focus on, it could be an icon, it could be a book, it could be an image, for example. So, that's how perennial philosophy helps us, showing us the underlying principles from which you can see the variety as not troublesome or disturbing, but as beautiful and nourishing. And in fact, the holy envy, concept of holy envy, you can see that the iconography in one religion, the calligraphy in another religion, the meditation practices in a third religion, they are exceptional, superior to what, or more developed than what we might have in our own tradition. The social practices in another religion might be so beautiful. The last point I want to say is the second word, cosmopolitanism. I always thought India was very plural, very diverse, but until I came to New York. And I found New York is far more diverse than India itself. It's not just diversity. It's wonderful to have have a pluralistic attitude that all religions are true and they can all take you, they have different paths to the same reality. But you can still have, exist in your own ivory towers, separate from each other. Somebody said India is diverse, but it's like a mosaic. In a mosaic floor, you have white and black tiles, multicolored tiles, but each tile is sharply demarcated from the other by boundaries. Whereas the idea in the United States was to be more of a melting pot than to have a mosaic of separation. So cosmopolitanism is the answer to that. So in New York, you have people from all over the world speaking different languages, enjoying each other's cuisine. It's a foodie's heaven. Enjoying each other's music and dress and fabrics, dance. So in religion too, the idea is to learn from the other, to be rooted in a tradition, in a particular tradition, and then learn and nourish one's spiritual life from the other. Saints and philosophers have been doing this throughout the ages. Throughout the ages. In Indian philosophy, just saying, they did not develop in isolation. They developed in dialogue with each other and learning and incorporating the DNA of other strands of thought. So cosmopolitanism it's a new idea. I think that's the way forward. Perennialism and cosmopolitanism. Thank you.
Thank you. We find that those few among us who respond to the religious dimension of human consciousness with utter sincerity do not seem to want to leave any domain of life untouched by that experience. Their aspiration is to let it permeate through every sector of our lives, not only when we go to a prayer room, to a temple or a mosque or a church, not only when we are on a pilgrimage, but in the way we conduct ourselves in daily life and relate to others, run business, or even engage in politics. Let us recall Mahatma Gandhi's famous utterance, those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion is. With this, I'm opening up to the audience for questions and answers. I know Sally has a particular question for David Rosen. So, follow the general rule that you mention your name and specify if the question is directed to any particular person. And be brief.
Oh, yes. So thank you, everyone, for your comments. And so I am involved in action. So I believe in the CCC, the cross-cultural conversations. And I also think that as part of that is action, is what we do on the ground. So here's, David, this is my question for you. I love the Holy Land. I've been there many times, and I just love it. So this is a bit of the elephant in the room, I think. How do you reconcile your views with life on the ground in Israel, founded as a Jewish state, and Amnesty International's February report that says Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, a cruel system of domination and a crime against humanity?
Can't hear.
You're muted. David, you're muted. Can you unmute, please?
I said, thank you for your question. I'm happy to answer it. But at the outset, we must make it patently clear that you've brought us into a very different context. Because we've been talking now in terms of the question of the roles of religion in the world. And Judaism is more than the state of Israel, in the same way that Islam is more than Saudi Arabia, or that Christianity is more than any one of the states that consider themselves Christian. Having been chief rabbi of Ireland, so I'm very familiar with the question of the abuse in the national context there. So you are now asking me a political question, and how I answer that depends upon my own political positions. it doesn't necessarily depend upon my religious affirmation, because you can see in different contexts an enormous spectrum of different religious approaches. However, let me nevertheless, I am speaking to you from Jerusalem, and I am an Israeli, and therefore I'm going to respond to you as an Israeli, and not so much as a spokesperson on behalf of Judaism. I don't think that you will find any Israeli Jew. Well, first of all, let's just start by talking about what Israel is. Israel is a Jewish state not in any confessional sense. It's a Jewish state in the way that France is a French state or Ireland is an Irish state. It is understood by the vast majority of Israelis to mean a state of the Jewish collective. So it's seen as a secular state. It is not a confessional state. People here can be as abusive of religion as they choose. They can curse God with such defamation as much as they choose. There are no laws punishing people for anything in that regard. There is a law to try to protect sensibilities of religions, but it's a very minor law. So this is a secular society. As an Orthodox rabbi, I would like the Jews here to be typified on the Sabbath by attendance at synagogues. But the reality is the Sabbath here is not to be found in the synagogues in Jerusalem, but on the beaches of Tel Aviv. So we have a very secular society in this regard. And 25% of it is Arab. The vast majority are Muslims, about 130,000 Arab Christians. We've got probably about 50,000 Christians from the former Soviet Union. We have about 250,000 Christians who are in terms of foreign workers. So there is an enormous mixture. And I would say that in terms of the Supreme Court, it's done a pretty good job of protecting the principle of freedom of religion, people of equality before the law. The real problem is not with regards to Israel. Therefore, to describe Israel as an apartheid state, if you mean the state of Israel, that's just silly. I mean, whatever the motivations are, anybody who comes here can see how, as I lived in South Africa and I was expelled from South Africa by the apartheid government, I know what it is. Any problems that occur here and any denial of human freedoms is not based on anything to do with race or ethnicity. And we come to where the source of these problems are, and that has to do essentially with the West Bank, formerly the situation with Gaza, which, as you know, therefore is the result of a conflict. Now, the narrative in Israel is that we've tried to extricate ourselves from this time again. That's why we went to Oslo, but essentially Palestinian violence has forced us back into it. The situation is one in which, therefore, inevitably innocent people suffer, and that this is very tragic. I personally am to be found on the left of the Israeli political spectrum. I'm a founder of an organization called Rabbis for Human Rights. We are focused primarily on abuses of Palestinian human rights. We believe that protecting Palestinian human rights is not only our religious imperative and obligation, but it's also ultimately good for the state of Israel. But nobody here, even amongst those who are on the right wing of the spectrum, believe that they need to behave aggressively or with strong armed tactics towards Palestinians because of their ethnicity or because of their color or because of their race or because of their religion. All their actions are done born out of their perception of how they are protecting Israeli security, which to a large degree go back to the Second Intifada, which brought about the collapse of the Oslo Accords and led to Israel's re-entry into areas it had vacated. Now, we could argue with Israel's tactics, and there's plenty of room to argue about Israel's tactics. And we could actually argue that, in fact, it's doing more to that's counterproductive to the interests of its security. But nevertheless, it's not motivated by any kind of fundamental racial or ethnic or religious hatred. And that's testified by the fact that you have this situation of where you have 25% or 20% of Muslims in the country. You have not only a government that now has just collapsed, but we have an Islamist party as part of it, that had a Muslim deputy chair of the Knesset, that has Muslim judges, that provides Sharia courts, probably the only country in the Western world that provides and maintains Sharia courts, paying Muslim judges the same as they do within the secular courts. So the situation is far more complex. It doesn't mean that I'm happy with Israeli policies or conduct within the situation, and I would like to see us get, if you'll excuse my Chinese, the hell out of the West Bank, because I think ultimately that's good for Israel, not just good for Palestinian dignity. I actually think it's good for the religion of Judaism, because I think for as long as we're in this situation, the religion of Judaism gets prostituted and perverted. But it's to suggest, as the amnesty thing does, and incidentally I've been associated with it, that this is in somehow similar to South Africa, shows a complete ignorance about Israeli society. It shows a focus upon the West Bank. The West Bank isn't a problem, and all I can say is we need to do more to be able to help ameliorate that situation. One thing we will not do, and that's what I say to Jews and I say to Christians and others that come to visit here. If you simply come to affirm one side and think that in this conflict you're doing some good to that side by ignoring the other side, then you're grossly misled. For as long as we have a zero-sum mentality and a perception that one is the devil and the other is somehow the angel incarnate, we are only exacerbating the situation, which will be bad for everyone. We need to have a win-win approach. And to be careful Palestinians does not mean you have to be hostile to Israel. To love Israel does not mean you have to be insensitive to the aspiration of dignity of the Palestinian people. The more we can support initiatives to advance that mutual respect, the more we will bring healing not only to the Holy Land but to the world.
Thank you.
All right, is there any other questions in the room? All right, I'm gonna go to this side. Make sure you tell us your name.
Pauline Kondo. Thank you for all of the information, all of the everything you've said this morning. My question, or my trouble, is all of the religions are full of hope, love, positivity, while recognizing pain. I guess my trouble is religion really only personal? If there's nothing to be said about the rise of theocracies, I think the United States, I mean, that's a big, strong word. There's a great deal of, bastardization, ruination of Christianity in the United States, which is leading our Supreme Court and some of our politicians towards something that would look like a theocracy if they won. I'm surprised but I guess there's a way of thinking of Israel as not a theocracy, but I think it sort of is in a way. And what about Hindu nationalism in India, so is religion only personal, and do we only relate to our close friends, our families in these ways, or is there a way of using religion, finding ways of religion to help our nations, which I think are struggling so terribly?
Thank you. Before we get an answer to that, because people's starting to move out of this room, so you guys on Zoom can't see this, the oven is broken. Lunch will be delayed. Don't leave here thinking you're going to get lunch at 12:30. You will not get lunch until 1. So just sit tight and enjoy the discussion. Okay, we have to have an answer. We have to let our panel answer the question. Thank you. Do you need the question restated? Or
No, I would like to know whether her question was direct to anyone's particular.
Actually, I would prefer not to hear from Rabbi Rosen, although I really appreciate everything he said. But let's hear from somebody else. I mean, yes. And then maybe at the end, Rabbi Rosen.
No, not everyone, only just, let's see. Anybody want to volunteer to answer this question?
I think a direct answer would be, of course, religion is not just private. I think that was the thesis of Anindita's book, that one of the problems of the way we have dealt with religion in the modern world is, for example, in international diplomacy, she has pointed out that you're not trained in religious sensibilities. You don't think religion is important enough to train diplomats in that. You're trained in strategy and economics and international relations, but not in religion. Or a second approach would be, yes, religion is important, but it's, as you said, it's just private. It's just your own. But it's not. It's not private. It's, as she quoted Mahatma Gandhi, somebody accused him of doing religion in politics. And his reply was an adamant and forthright. He said, the two greatest forces for good that I know are religion and politics. So as long as I live, I shall not stop doing religion in politics and politics in religion. Yeah, but straight answer to your question is no. It's not a private matter at all. That's in fact the whole issue.
So why is the world suffering so? I think partly from the rise of theocracy.
Anybody else?
Well, first of all, I would like to reiterate that religion is, of course, a public force. Otherwise, why do we have all these communities, the sanghas, and all that? And that demarcating the world population using religious identity as a criterion. Of course, this is a private matter also, very much so. In fact, that aspect of religious identity, it has not been possible for me to address in this conference because of the time constraints. It's only one session or two sessions that have been devoted to this theme. Religious is both personal as well as a public matter. And if I had to go into it, I think others won't be able to ask their questions. Oh, and why? She said, why then we have all these problems? It is because what you saw, that all these religious teachings, one is teaching love and peace and non-violence and all that. And what is happening in practice? They are not all Mahatma Gandhis, our political leaders, that they want to bring in that message and do politics by keeping those values in mind. So what we practice and what is being taught, they do not coincide.
Our next question will come from Marian Griswold, but I would like to just say one thing. It's always important to look at who is at the table and who is not. So I wanted to let you know we were meant to have Linda Hogan, who is an indigenous of indigenous religions. She was not able to come, but it's really important to just notice that there are many religions not represented at the table, and that is part of the reason why Donna Roberts will present her film, which is of an indigenous religion, and Candomblé tomorrow. So we're trying to these are very predominant, concerted religions, at least in the way that they're perceived, but then there are many indigenous religions who are not here with us.
Thanks, Marianne Griswold. My comment or question really kind of follows on Pauline and Sally both. And Amy talked about, religion is a human construct. It's not religion that's the problem, it's human beings that are the problem. But it seems to me that that's letting religion off the hook too much. I think of course it's a human construct and it's human beings who practice it and carry it out. But religions also have the responsibility to perhaps, I don't know, be more forceful or something about directing how we humans are carrying out our religious beliefs and so forth. I just think, I think I'm saying what Pauline was saying, or trying to say, that I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Marian. So I think the question is, ought not the religious leaders, the Pope, I guess Hinduism doesn't have a leader? Does it have a leader? So somebody who's, or, the Dalai Lama speaks out all the time, so we can't lay this at him. But leaders of Judaism, leaders of the various Islamic traditions, the Christian traditions, speak out when there are, much more strongly, when there are indignities being done to other people. And we find that they don't. And might that not be a way for religion to find its way more successfully into the political life? Thank you, Marian, for helping me out.
Anyone want to answer that? No, does anyone on the board, on the panel want to?
I think that the criticism of religious leaders is always valid. Religious leaders can always do more than they do, and they should take responsibility for the failures not to do as much as they should do. Yet nevertheless, I think the question points to a much bigger problem. I'm involved in many global interfaith organizations. One of them is probably the largest, which is called Religions for Peace. Its headquarters is actually in New York. It issues statements almost all the time because there's always an atrocity of one kind or another going on in a different world. And these are going out, and it's only just one organization. I wonder how many of you are familiar with those statements, or with the statements even of other organizations like URI, or even the Parliament of the World Religions, or even of CAICI. There are so many of these multi-faith organizations around the world celebrating religious diversity and seeking to give ethical guidance. But they're not getting visibility. Why? For a couple of reasons. First of all, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. And the negative info gets coverage, it boosts the rating, gets the television attention. But in the final analysis, it's all of us. If we are not broadcasting the positive statements of the religions, trying to combat the abuse of religion and the abuse of humanity in the world today, we are at fault for not doing more to be able to know about it and to broadcast it and to disseminate it widely. The very minimum you can do is to go to Religions for Peace website and see the statements and declarations are one amongst very many of the multi-faith world, because today we live in a world where there has never ever been as much multi-faith collaboration as there is today. It's a booming industry, and it's precisely focused on action. The work of Religions for Peace is focused on trying to be able to combat violence, peace education, addressing issues of weapons of mass destruction, all those areas. The tragedy is that it's being only consumed within a very small coterie of people that care about this particular interface, and others, therefore, simply not paying any attention to it. So it's the responsibility of all of us to ensure that these statements and these declarations and these engagements and these initiatives, which include the recent initiatives with regards to Ukraine, become known, rather than simply sitting in our armchairs and criticizing the religious communities, which is always a good thing to do.
All right, and Vita, do you have any concluding comments you want to make?
Just requesting each one of them to say one line of prayer or any thought that you have from within your tradition that would empower and encourage the type of inquiry that we are undertaking here. From your tradition.
Why don't we just start and go down the line, and then we'll do the ones online last.
Okay, so maybe this is the most difficult question, to try and summarize, all prayer in one line. But if I were to do that, I would be inspired by Imam Ali, who was the first Imam of the 12 Rashiyas, and I'm just translating randomly, the Arabic prayer into English and saying, "O God, suffices it for my identity that I am your servant. And it suffices for me for pride that you are my Lord. I have found you the best of lords, and I hope that you find me the best of your creatures. I ask that you empower my body so that it can work for justice, and that you empower my mind so that it can keep seeking you in every other that I encounter."
Amen. Swami?
Here's a peace chant from the Upanishads. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityurma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real, lead us from darkness unto light, lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace.
Amen.
Onye dawa rinpoche, mage bana, That's my mumbo jumbo to you.
What does it mean? Is there any?
The meaning of the first prayer is wish to increase our loving kindness, compassion to every living being to increase. Along with that, the wisdom, knowledge, all humanity wish to come together to cherishing these two qualities. Thank you.
I will say the last.
David, Rabbi, would you like to go next? Oh, you're muted.
No, I'm off now. Thank you. I managed. Thank you very much. This is a little bit from a prayer composed actually by one of the great Hasidic rabbis in the Ukraine in the 18th century. May it be your will, O Lord our God, God of our ancestors, that war and bloodshed will cease from the world and a great and wonderful peace will embrace the world. As in the words of Isaiah, nation will not lift up sword against nation, and they will learn war no more. Lord, have mercy on us, that we may witness the fulfillment of the promises in Scripture. I will bring peace to the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall terrify you. I will rid vicious beasts, that you will not be ravaged by war. Let justice and righteousness flow like a mighty stream, and may the knowledge of the divine fill the earth as the waters fill the sea. Amen.
Amen. Pastor?
So I'll share a prayer that you might find familiar. It's the prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
This is from the Upanishads. In Sanskrit, it sounds like this. Ayam bandhur, ayam neti, ganana laghuchetasam, udara charitanam tu pasidhaiva kutumbakam. The shallow-minded say, this one is a friend, a relative. That one is not. Those who are magnanimous, for them, the whole world is a family.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Give everyone thank you online. I know you can't see us, but thank you so much. At this time, I just want to remind you that we will again start back up at 1:45. Hopefully that will happen, and we'll have our scholar, the person that will be talking to us, is our second, or is our one of our scholars. So 1:45. Remember, lunch is at 1. So hopefully that gives us enough time to get some nourishment. Remember, there is no memorial service, but Sally will be speaking in here, and Ted will be speaking in Newton West.
That's right, yeah. He's written a lot of books. Updating gentlemen.